Hello, today, as we continue to look at the Lord's Supper, we'll look at the last element before preparing for the Lord's Supper on Sunday, which is the idea of sacrifice. And I think it's probably one of the biggest. And so, looking again at Luke 22, Jesus says, "But behold, the hand of the one betraying me is with mine on the table. For indeed the Son of Man is going as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." And so it's the idea that Jesus, of course, knew that Judas would betray him to the Romans and to the Jewish leaders at the time, but he allowed himself to be given because he was the Lamb of God. And so that's pointed out here in John chapter 1, where when John the Baptist sees him, he says, it says this, "The next day he, being John the Baptist, saw Jesus coming to him and said, 'Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world.'" And so again, the Father offered his Son as a lamb for sacrifice for the sins of the world, which is an amazing idea because, again, it points back to Isaac, who was offered up by Abraham willingly. The Lord intervened at that time, but it was pointing forward to the Father himself offering up Jesus, his only Son, as a sacrifice for us and for the sins of the world. And so John 18, at the end of the account of the gospel here, points to just how willingly Jesus allowed himself to be given for a sacrifice for us. In verse 3 it says, "So Judas, having obtained the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons." So this big cohort came towards Jesus to arrest him. Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, came out into the open and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus, the Nazarene." He said to him, "I am." And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. Now then, when he said, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. So Jesus uttered these two words, "I am." He is added for context in the Bible there, but he literally just said two words, "I am." And when he said that, all the soldiers and everybody that was there to arrest him fell on the ground, because that was a statement of divinity, that Jesus is God, that he is one with God. And when he said that again, they all fell to the ground, which was a sign that he was allowing himself to be taken. He was allowing himself to become a sacrifice, the Lamb of God. And it's just an amazing scene to consider again. He left the glories of heaven, took on the flesh, and lived among us for a short period of time, and then allowed himself to become an actual sacrifice for us. So in John chapter 19, again, just after his arrest, is the account of what he suffered as a sacrifice in part. Starting at the beginning of the chapter, it says, "So Pilate then took Jesus and had him flogged." And again, a Roman flogging was extreme in terms of the cat of nine tails, which most people are familiar with, had glass and metal and shards of pottery that would grasp onto the flesh and then pull it off and then break through that and the muscle and everything else, to where most people died just from that alone, the blood loss and the pain and the shock that produced. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and placed it on his head and put a purple cloak on him. So again, crown of thorns, again, just in itself would be so extreme in the intensity of pain from the sensitivity of the scalp and the bleeding and the punctures that are taking place upon someone's head. And then mockingly putting a cloak upon his back where the skin and the muscle had already been torn off and it's bleeding profusely, to where the cloak sticks to all of that. And then on top of that, it says they repeatedly came to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and slapped him in the face again and again. And then Pilate came out again and said to him, "See, I'm bringing him out to you, so that you will know that I find no grounds at all for charges in his case." Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So the chief priests and the officers saw him. They shouted, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to him, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no grounds for charges in his case." So again, this is what Christ allowed himself to be subjected to: the beating, the mocking, and again, this is just part of the account, part of the pain that he suffered from. In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul says this: "He made him," meaning that the Father made the Son, who knew no sin, to be sin in our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So again, the Father offered him as a sacrifice for us, so that we might be righteous, perfectly righteous in him. And then we think of the implications of this as Christ offered himself up, as he took up his cross and couldn't even carry it because of, again, the weakness and the pain and the breaking of his body that had taken place up to that point. But being sacrificed and absorbing the wrath of God, becoming sin, as Paul says, how do we respond to that? How do we respond to that in specifically the Lord's Supper? How do we frame that in the context of our daily life? Well, Paul says here in Romans, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." So we worship and we observe and respond to his sacrifice by giving up ourselves to be a living sacrifice. He became a sacrifice through death, but we can be a sacrifice through life every day of giving to God what he has entrusted to us from our daily life. That's our response, our reasonable response to what the Father has given to us through the sacrifice of his only Son. So just a quick thought again on this as we prepare for the Lord's Supper, and to keep that in mind moving forward, the great sacrifice of Christ and what the Father gave to us through his Son, and how we can respond as a daily living sacrifice for him as well. Take care.